What happens when a family's darkest secret can no longer be hidden? When love crosses the most dangerous boundaries of society and the consequences arrive in the form of two innocent lives? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping historical stories like this one. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Whitmore Manor, casting long shadows across the mahogany floors that had witnessed 3 generations of southern propriety. In the master bedroom, Margaret Whitmore sat propped against silk pillows, her face pale as porcelain, cradling 2 newborn babies whose dark skins seemed to absorb the golden light streaming through the windows. The silence in the room was deafening. Her sisters, Eleanor and Catherine, stood frozen at the foot of the bed, their faces masks of horror and disbelief. Eleanor, the eldest at 35, clutched her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Catherine, barely 28, pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, as if trying to hold back words that could never be spoken. "Margaret." Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, trembling like autumn leaves before a storm. How could this happen? Margaret's green eyes, once bright with the innocence of her 23 years, now held depths of pain that seemed to age her beyond her time. She looked down at the sleeping infants in her arms, perfect, beautiful, and undeniably evidence of a truth that could destroy them all. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Look at them, Eleanor, they're just beautiful." But Eleanor couldn't look, neither could Catherine. Their eyes darted everywhere except to the babies whose very existence challenged everything their world stood for. The Confederate flags that still hung in the parlor, the portraits of their grandfather who had built this plantation on the backs of enslaved labor, the social standing that had taken generations to establish, all of it seemed to crumble in the face of these 2 tiny lives. Through the window, they could see the quarters where the field hands lived, small wooden structures that housed the men and women who still worked the land despite the war's end 3 years prior. Among them was Samuel, the 26-year-old man, whose intelligent dark eyes and gentle hands had captured Margaret's heart in the most impossible of circumstances. "Where is he?" Catherine finally found her voice, though it shook with fear. "Where is Samuel?" Margaret's grip tightened on the babies. "He doesn't know. He left for town yesterday morning before they were born." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Margaret's husband, Colonel James Whitmore, had died of a sudden heart attack 6 months earlier, just 3 days after discovering his wife's condition and the impossible truth of who the father might be. The shock had literally killed him, leaving Margaret a widow at 23, pregnant with twins that would forever mark her shame. Eleanor began pacing, her silk dress rustling with each agitated step. "We have to think. We have to plan. The neighbors, the church, the entire county will know the moment anyone sees them." "They already suspect," Catherine added, her voice hollow. "Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring plantation has been asking questions. She knows James died before the timing would make sense." Margaret looked up at her sisters, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I loved him," she said simply. "I know it was wrong, I know it was impossible, but I loved him. And he loved me." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. In their world, such words were not just scandalous, they were dangerous. Love between a white woman and a black man wasn't just forbidden, it was a crime that could cost lives. Eleanor stopped pacing and turned to face her youngest sister. "Love?" she hissed. "Margaret, this isn't about love, this is about survival. Do you understand what they'll do if they find out? What they'll do to him? To us? To these children?" The babies stirred in Margaret's arms, and she began to rock them gently. Humming a lullaby their mother had once sung to them, the melody filled the room with a bittersweet tenderness that made the situation even more heartbreaking. "I won't let anything happen to them," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength. "Or to him, I won't." Catherine moved closer to the bed, finally allowing herself to look at the infants. Despite everything, despite the fear and the impossible situation, she couldn't deny their beauty. They had Margaret's delicate features, but Samuel's warm brown skin and dark curly hair. They were perfect, innocent, and completely unaware of the storm their existence had created. "They look like him," Catherine whispered almost to herself. "They look exactly like Samuel." Eleanor's face went even paler. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that again." "But it's true," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "Anyone who sees them will know. There's no hiding it, Eleanor. No pretending." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made all three women freeze. Heavy, measured steps that could only belong to one person, Dr. Morrison, the family physician who had delivered the babies and who now held their secret in his weathered hands. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," Margaret called, quickly pulling a blanket higher over the babies. Dr. Morrison entered, his grey beard neatly trimmed, his kind eyes troubled. He had been the Whitmore family doctor for over 20 years, had delivered all three sisters, and had never faced a situation quite like this one. "How are you feeling, my dear?" he asked Margaret, though his eyes kept drifting to the bundles in her arms. "Tired," she replied honestly, "but they're healthy. Perfectly healthy," he confirmed, then paused. "Margaret, we need to discuss arrangements." Eleanor stepped forward. "What kind of arrangements?" "Doctor," Morrison looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "There are options. Families who would take them. Good families, far from here, where no one would ask questions." "No." Margaret's voice was firm, final. "They're my children. They stay with me." "Margaret, be reasonable," Eleanor pleaded. "You can't possibly think you can raise them here. Look at them. Everyone will know." "Then let them know," Margaret said, surprising herself with her own courage. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of living in fear." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "There's something else. Samuel, he's been asking questions about you, about the babies. Word travels fast in the quarters." The room fell silent again. Through the window, they could see a figure approaching the main house, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence that had first attracted Margaret's attention months ago. Samuel was coming home. "He can't come here," Eleanor said frantically. "Not now, not ever again." But Margaret was already struggling to sit up straighter, her eyes fixed on the window. "He has a right to know. They're his children too." "Rights?" Eleanor's voice rose dangerously. "He has no rights. None. Do you understand what you're saying?" Catherine moved to the window, watching as Samuel approached. "He's coming to the back door," she reported. "Like always." The irony was bitter. Even now, even as the father of Margaret's children, Samuel knew his place in their world's twisted hierarchy. He would never presume to use the front entrance, never assume equality despite the love he shared with Margaret. "I have to see him," Margaret said, attempting to rise from the bed. "You'll do no such thing," Eleanor commanded. "Dr. Morrison, please, help me make her understand the gravity of this situation." The elderly doctor looked between the sisters, his expression pained. "Margaret, your sister is right about the dangers, but—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "These babies will need care, proper care. And Samuel, he's a good man. I've seen how he looks at you, how you look at him, in a different world." "This isn't a different world," Eleanor interrupted. "This is Georgia 1868. This is reality." A soft knock came from the back of the house, the servants' entrance. They all knew who it was. Margaret looked at her sisters, then at Dr. Morrison, and finally down at the sleeping babies in her arms. "Bring him up," she said quietly. "Please." "Margaret, no," Catherine whispered. "Bring him up," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He deserves to see his children." Eleanor threw her hands up in despair. "You're going to get us all killed." But Dr. Morrison was already moving toward the door. "I'll get him," he said simply. "Some things are more important than convention." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, the three sisters were left alone with the weight of their decision. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Margaret couldn't help but think they were a perfect metaphor for what was coming. The babies stirred again, and one of them, a little boy, opened his eyes for the first time since birth. They were dark brown, intelligent, and seemed to look right through Margaret to her soul. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she would do whatever it took to protect him and his sister, no matter the cost. They all resemble the slave, don't they? Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. Margaret looked up at her sister, her jaw set with determination. His name is Samuel, and yes, they look like their father. The sound of footsteps returning up the stairs made them all hold their breath. In moments, Samuel would see his children for the first time, and there would be no going back. The secret would be shared, the burden distributed, and their fates would be forever intertwined. As the door opened and Samuel's familiar silhouette appeared, Margaret whispered the words that would change everything. "Come meet your son and daughter." Samuel stood in the doorway as if he'd been struck by lightning, his work-worn hands trembling at his sides. The man who could lift a full-grown horse, who had worked the fields since he was barely tall enough to reach the cotton plants, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of this moment. "Margaret?" His voice was barely audible, thick with emotion and disbelief. She smiled through her tears, lifting the babies slightly so he could see them better. "Come closer, Samuel, please." Eleanor and Catherine pressed themselves against the far wall, as if distance could somehow protect them from the magnitude of what was happening. Dr. Morrison remained by the door, a silent guardian of this impossible moment. Samuel took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was standing beside the bed. His dark eyes moved from Margaret's face to the bundles in her arms, and when he saw them, really saw them, his knees nearly buckled. "There," he started, then stopped, overcome. "They're ours," Margaret finished softly. "A boy and a girl." Samuel's large, gentle hands reached out, then pulled back, uncertainty written across his features. "May I?" Margaret nodded, carefully transferring the baby boy into his father's arms. Samuel held him as if he were made of spun glass, his eyes wide with wonder and terror in equal measure. "He's so small," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. "So perfect." The baby opened his eyes at the sound of his father's voice, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Father and son looked at each other for the first time, and the resemblance was unmistakable. The same intelligent eyes, the same strong jawline, the same quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from both of them. "What are their names?" Samuel asked, never taking his eyes off his son. Margaret looked at her sisters, then back at Samuel. I haven't named them yet. I wanted to wait. I wanted you to help choose." Eleanor made a sound of distress from across the room. "Margaret, this is madness. Pure madness." But Samuel was already reaching for the baby girl, and Margaret placed her gently in his other arm. Now he held both of his children, and the sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Here was a man who, in the eyes of the law and society, had no right to these children, no claim to their lives, no legal standing as their father, yet the love in his eyes was undeniable. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like their mama." Catherine stepped forward slightly, her fear warring with curiosity. "Samuel," she said quietly, "do you understand what this means? What could happen?" Samuel looked up at her, and for the first time since entering the room, his expression hardened. "I understand perfectly, Miss Catherine. I understand that I love your sister. I understand that these are my children, and I understand that the world we live in says that's impossible." "It's not just impossible," Eleanor interjected, her voice sharp with fear. "It's deadly, for all of us." Samuel's gaze moved to Eleanor, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Miss Eleanor, with all due respect, I've been living with the threat of death my entire life. Every day I wake up black in Georgia is a day I might not see the end of. But these children," he looked down at the babies in his arms, "they're worth any risk." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Samuel, you need to understand the practical realities. Margaret is a widow now, but she's still a white woman from a prominent family. These children, their parentage will be obvious to anyone who sees them. Then we leave," Samuel said simply. "All of us. We go north where things are different." Margaret's heart leaped at the suggestion, but Eleanor was already shaking her head violently. "Leave? Leave Whitmore Manor? This is our home, our legacy. Our parents are buried here, our grandparents. We can't just abandon everything." "What legacy?" Margaret asked, her voice gaining strength. A legacy built on the backs of enslaved people, a legacy of hatred and oppression. Maybe it's time for a new legacy. Samuel looked at her with such love and admiration that it made Catherine's heart ache. She had never seen anyone look at her that way, had never experienced the kind of love that could transcend every barrier society could construct. "We could go to Philadelphia," Samuel said, his voice growing more confident. "I have a cousin there, works in a factory. Says there are opportunities for people willing to work hard." "And what would we be there?" Eleanor demanded. "Outcasts? Pariahs? Do you think the North is some promised land where no one will care about the color of your skin or the scandal of this situation?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "No, Miss Eleanor. I don't think it's a promised land. But I think it's a place where my children might have a chance at a real life, where they won't have to hide who they are or be ashamed of their parents." The baby girl began to fuss, and Margaret reached for her. As Samuel transferred his daughter back to her mother's arms, their hands touched, and the electricity between them was palpable. Even now, even in this impossible situation, their love was undeniable. "There's another option," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "One that might allow you all to stay." Everyone turned to look at him. "The children could be explained. Margaret, you could say they were adopted, orphans from a family that died of fever. It's not uncommon for wealthy families to take in children in need." "Adopted?" Samuel's voice was sharp. "You want me to pretend these aren't my children?" "It would protect them," Dr. Morrison said gently, "and it would protect you, all of you." Margaret shook her head. "I won't lie about who they are. I won't deny Samuel his children or deny them their father." "Then what do you propose?" Eleanor asked, her voice edged with hysteria. "That we all just pretend this is normal? That we introduce Samuel as the father at Sunday service? That we invite the neighbors over for tea and explain how our sister fell in love with a former slave?" The word slave hung in the air like a slap. Samuel flinched, and Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "He was never a slave," she said fiercely. "Not in his heart, not in his mind. The law may have called him that, but he was always free where it mattered." Samuel looked at her with such gratitude that it brought tears to his eyes. "Margaret, no," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm tired of the lies, tired of the pretending. I love you, Samuel. I love our children, and I don't care who knows it." Catherine moved closer to the bed, her expression thoughtful. What if there was a middle way?" Everyone looked at her. What if Samuel stayed, but differently? What if he became the children's caretaker, their guardian? It wouldn't be unheard of for a widow to employ someone to help with her children. Eleanor stared at her sister in shock. "Catherine, you can't be serious." "Think about it," Catherine continued, warming to the idea. "Samuel could be here, could be part of their lives, but in a way that wouldn't raise as many questions. People might talk, but they wouldn't necessarily assume." "They'd assume," Samuel said quietly. "One look at these babies, and they'll know exactly what happened." Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. "He's right. The resemblance is too strong. There's no hiding it." Margaret looked down at her children, then at Samuel, then at her sisters. "Then we don't hide it, we face it head on." "Margaret," Eleanor pleaded, "please think about what you're saying. Think about the consequences." "I am thinking about them," Margaret replied. "I'm thinking about my children growing up ashamed of who they are. I'm thinking about Samuel having to pretend he doesn't love them. I'm thinking about living the rest of my life as a lie." Samuel knelt beside the bed, his eyes level with Margaret's. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Because once we make this choice, there's no going back." Margaret reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The baby boy began to cry, a strong, healthy sound that filled the room. Samuel stood and gently took him from Margaret, beginning to rock him with a natural ease that spoke of deep paternal instincts. "Hush now, little man," while he murmured, "Your daddy's here." The words sent a chill through Eleanor, but Catherine found herself smiling despite her fears. There was something beautiful about watching Samuel with his son, something that transcended all the social barriers and prejudices of their world. "We'll need a plan," Dr. Morrison said practically. "If you're determined to do this, we'll need to think through every detail." "What kind of plan?" Margaret asked. "Well, for starters, Samuel can't continue living in the quarters. If he's going to be part of this family, he'll need different arrangements." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "Different arrangements? Doctor, you're talking about a black man living in the main house with a white woman and their children in Georgia in 1868. Do you understand how insane that sounds?" "I understand how it sounds, Doctor," Morrison replied calmly. "I also understand that love doesn't follow the rules society sets for it." Samuel looked up from the baby he was holding. "There's a small cabin on the far edge of the property. It's been empty since old Tom passed. I could fix it up, make it livable, close enough to help with the children, far enough to avoid complications." Margaret nodded. "That could work. And Samuel, you could take my name. Become Samuel Whitmore. It would give you some protection, some legal standing." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything their world stood for. A black man taking a white family's name, claiming a place in their lineage. It was revolutionary, dangerous, and completely unprecedented. "Margaret," Eleanor whispered, "you're talking about changing everything. Everything our family has stood for, everything we've built." Margaret looked at her sister with sad but determined eyes. "Maybe it's time everything changed, Eleanor. Maybe what our family has stood for wasn't worth preserving." The baby girl began to fuss, and Margaret began to nurse her, the simple, natural act somehow making everything feel more real, more immediate. These weren't abstract concepts or philosophical debates. These were real children who needed love, protection, and a future. "I need time to think," Eleanor said finally. This is too much. Time is something we don't have much of," Dr. Morrison warned. "Word is already spreading about the babies. Mrs. Henderson has been asking pointed questions, and you know how quickly gossip travels in this county." Samuel handed the baby boy back to Margaret and moved toward the window. In the distance, he could see other workers returning from the fields, their day's labor complete. Soon they would know about the babies, and the secret would be impossible to contain. "Whatever we decide," he said quietly, "we need to decide soon." Margaret looked at her children, then at the man she loved, then at her sisters, who were struggling to accept a reality that challenged everything they'd been taught to believe. The weight of the decision pressed down on all of them, but underneath the fear and uncertainty, she felt something else. Hope. "We'll make it work," she said firmly. "Somehow we'll make it work." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the storm clouds gathering outside, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges were still ahead. 3 weeks had passed since the birth of the twins, and the fragile peace that had settled over Whitmore Manor was about to shatter. Margaret had named the children Thomas and Sarah. Strong, simple names that she hoped would serve them well in whatever world they would inhabit. Samuel had moved into the small cabin on the edge of the property, officially employed as the children's caretaker, though everyone who saw him with the babies understood the true nature of their relationship. The morning started like any other, with Samuel arriving at the main house before dawn to help with the children's feeding. Margaret had grown stronger, but the demands of caring for twins were exhausting, and Samuel's presence was both practical and emotionally necessary. Eleanor had maintained a cold distance from the arrangement, speaking to Samuel only when absolutely necessary, and treating the entire situation as a temporary madness that would eventually resolve itself. Catherine, however, had surprised everyone by gradually warming to the children and even developing a grudging respect for Samuel's devotion to them. Dr. Morrison had become an unexpected ally, visiting regularly under the pretense of checking on Margaret's recovery, but actually serving as a buffer between the family and the increasingly curious community. His presence lent an air of medical necessity to Samuel's constant attendance, providing a thin but crucial layer of protection. But on this particular morning, as Samuel quietly entered through the back door as he had every day for 3 weeks, He found Eleanor waiting for him in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Samuel," she said without preamble, "you need to leave. Now. Today." Samuel set down the basket of vegetables he'd brought from the garden. "What's happened?" "Mrs. Henderson was here yesterday evening. After you'd gone back to your cabin, she brought 3 other ladies from town." Eleanor's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "They came to pay their respects and see the babies." Samuel's blood ran cold. And they saw them, Samuel. They saw Thomas and Sarah, and they knew. Immediately. Mrs. Henderson took one look at those children, and her face went white as a sheet. Samuel sank into a chair, the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. What did they say? Nothing, not directly, but the looks they exchanged, the whispers when they thought we couldn't hear. Eleanor began pacing, her silk dress rustling with agitation. Mrs. Henderson asked pointed questions about when exactly James died, about Margaret's confinement, about why the babies looked so different. "Where's Margaret now?" "Upstairs with the children. She doesn't know about the visit yet." I couldn't bring myself to tell her." Samuel stood, his jaw set with determination. "I need to see her." "No," Eleanor said firmly, blocking his path. "You need to leave. Pack whatever you can carry and go tonight before this gets any worse. I'm not leaving my children." "They're not your children," Eleanor's voice rose dangerously. "Not in the eyes of the law, not in the eyes of God, not in the eyes of anyone who matters in this world." Samuel's eyes flashed with anger. "They're my children in every way that matters. I won't abandon them." "Then you'll get them killed," Eleanor shot back. "Do you think this is some romantic story where love conquers all? This is Georgia, Samuel. This is reality. And the reality is that if you stay, if people confirm what they already suspect, they won't just come for you. They'll come for Margaret, they'll come for the babies, they'll come for all of us." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their argument. Margaret appeared in the doorway, carrying Thomas while Sarah slept in a basket. She took one look at their faces and knew something was terribly wrong. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged glances, neither wanting to be the one to shatter her world. "Tell me," Margaret insisted, moving into the kitchen and setting the basket down carefully. Samuel took a deep breath. "Some ladies from town came to visit yesterday. They saw the children." Margaret's face went pale, but her voice remained calm. "And?" "And they know," Eleanor said bluntly. "They know exactly what these children represent. And by now, half the county knows too." Margaret sank into a chair, still holding Thomas, who began to fuss as if sensing his mother's distress. "How long do we have?" "Have for what?" Eleanor asked. "Before they come," Margaret said simply. "Before the mob forms, before the righteous anger takes hold, before they decide to take justice into their own hands." Samuel knelt beside her chair. "Margaret, I can leave. I can disappear. And you can tell them whatever story you want about the children. Say they're adopted. Say they're from a family that died of fever. Say anything that will protect you." Margaret looked at him with such fierce love that it took his breath away. "I won't lie about my children. I won't deny who their father is. And I won't let you sacrifice yourself for our safety." "Then what do you propose we do?" Eleanor demanded. "Because I can tell you right now that staying here and pretending everything is normal is not an option." Margaret stood, beginning to pace while still holding Thomas. "We leave, all of us, tonight." "Leave?" Eleanor's voice was shrill. "Leave our home, our life, everything we've ever known?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "We take the children and we go north. We start over somewhere where people don't know our history, where Thomas and Sarah can grow up without shame." Catherine appeared in the doorway, having heard the raised voices. "What's going on?" Eleanor quickly filled her in on the situation, and Catherine's face grew increasingly pale as she understood the implications. "We can't all leave," Catherine said practically. "Someone needs to stay and manage the property, deal with the legal issues, maintain some semblance of normalcy." "I'll stay," Eleanor said immediately. I'll handle things here. Make excuses for Margaret's absence. Deal with the gossip and questions. Margaret looked at her sister with surprise and gratitude. Eleanor, you don't have to— Yes, I do, Eleanor interrupted. I may not understand your choices, Margaret, and I may not approve of them, but you're my sister. These children are my blood, regardless of who their father is. I won't let anything happen to them. Samuel stood, his expression grim. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Pack only what's essential. We'll take the wagon and leave after dark. Where will we go? Margaret asked. Philadelphia, like we discussed. My cousin there can help us get settled, find work, establish new identities if necessary. Dr. Morrison's voice came from the back door. I'm afraid it may be too late for that. They all turned to see the elderly physician entering, his face grave. Doctor? Margaret said. What do you mean? I've just come from town. There's talk, Margaret. Ugly talk. Mrs. Henderson has been very busy spreading her suspicions, and they're gaining traction. Sheriff Williams has been asking questions about Samuel's whereabouts, about his relationship to this family. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's considering an investigation, or worse. Doctor, Morrison looked directly at Samuel. Son, I think you need to leave, tonight, alone. No, Margaret said immediately. We go together, or not at all. Margaret, be reasonable, Dr. Morrison pleaded. If Samuel disappears, the talk might die down. People might accept whatever explanation you give for the children. But if you all leave together— It confirms everything, Eleanor finished. It makes you all fugitives. Margaret looked around the kitchen that had been her home for her entire life, at the sisters who had shared her childhood, at the man who had given her the greatest love and the greatest challenge of her life. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a physical force. There's something else, Dr. Morrison said quietly. Something you all need to know. They waited, dreading what new catastrophe he might reveal. James's brother Robert is coming. He sent word yesterday. He'll be here tomorrow to settle the estate and to take custody of the children. The words hit like a thunderbolt. Robert Whitmore was everything his brother had been and worse, a rigid, cruel man who had never hidden his contempt for anything that challenged his view of the natural order. He can't, Margaret whispered. They're my children. Legally, as James's brother and the closest male relative, he has a strong claim, Dr. Morrison said gently, especially if questions arise about their legitimacy. Samuel's face had gone ashen. He'll separate them from Margaret. He'll send them away. Or worse, Eleanor said quietly. Robert has never been known for his compassion, especially toward people he considers beneath his station. Margaret clutched Thomas tighter, her mind racing. Then we leave tonight, before he arrives. Margaret, Catherine said gently, if you run now, you'll never be able to come back. You'll be fugitives for the rest of your lives. Then that's what we'll be, Margaret said with fierce determination. I won't let Robert take my children. I won't let him destroy our family. Samuel moved to the window, checking the position of the sun. We have maybe 6 hours before full dark. That's enough time to pack essentials and prepare the wagon. I'll help, Catherine said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her in surprise. Catherine, Eleanor said, I'll help them pack, help them prepare. And then— She took a deep breath. I'm going with them. What? Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Catherine's chin lifted with determination that reminded them all of their mother. I'm going with them. I won't stay here and watch Robert destroy what's left of this family. I won't pretend that love is something to be ashamed of. Eleanor stared at her sisters, realizing that her world was crumbling around her. You're all insane. Completely insane. Maybe, Margaret said, moving to embrace her eldest sister, but we're insane together. Eleanor stood rigid for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace. I still think you're making a terrible mistake. Maybe we are, Samuel said quietly. But it's our mistake to make. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. If you're determined to do this, I can help. I have contacts in Philadelphia, people who might be able to assist you in establishing new lives. Margaret looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, her sisters, the man who had captured her heart, the doctor who had become their unlikely ally. "Then we do this together." As if in response to her words, both babies began to cry simultaneously, their voices joining in a chorus that seemed to announce the beginning of a new chapter. Margaret and Samuel moved instinctively to comfort them, working together with the natural rhythm of parents who had found their calling despite impossible circumstances. "We'll need money," Catherine said practically. "Enough to get established, to live on until you can find work." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I can access the household funds, convert some of the jewelry to cash. It won't be a fortune, but it should be enough to get you started. And I'll spread word that Margaret has gone to visit relatives in Charleston," Dr. Morrison added. "That should buy you some time before anyone realizes you're truly gone." Samuel looked at Margaret, his eyes full of love and determination. "Are you sure about this? Once we leave, there's no going back." Margaret looked down at Thomas in her arms, then at Sarah sleeping peacefully in her basket, then back at the man who had given her everything worth fighting for. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As the sun began to set over Whitmore Manor, casting long shadows across the grounds that had been home to 3 generations of the family, they began to prepare for a journey that would change everything. The storm that had been building for weeks was finally breaking, and they would either weather it together or be destroyed by it. But for the first time since the children were born, Margaret felt something she hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of a future where love could triumph over hate, where her children could grow up free from shame, and where the family they had chosen could flourish despite the world's determination to tear them apart. The real test was just beginning. The wagon wheels creaked softly against the dirt road as they made their way through the darkness. The only sound besides the gentle breathing of the sleeping babies and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Margaret sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in her warmest cloak with Thomas and Sarah nestled against her chest. Catherine sat beside her, while Samuel drove the team with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life working with horses. They had been traveling for 3 hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Whitmore Manor before dawn broke, and their absence was discovered. The wagon was loaded with everything they could carry: clothes, money, a few precious family heirlooms that Catherine had insisted on bringing, and supplies for the babies. Eleanor had stood in the doorway as they prepared to leave, her face a mask of controlled emotion. At the last moment, she had pressed a small velvet pouch into Margaret's hands. "Mother's pearls," she had whispered. "They're worth enough to keep you comfortable for a while." The memory of that moment brought tears to Margaret's eyes now. Eleanor had chosen to stay behind, to face whatever consequences came, to protect their family's reputation as much as possible. It was a sacrifice that Margaret would never forget. "How much further to the railroad?" Catherine asked quietly, not wanting to wake the babies. "Another 2 hours to the station in Macon," Samuel replied, his voice low. "The morning train to Atlanta leaves at 7. From there we can catch the northbound to Philadelphia." Margaret adjusted her hold on the babies, marveling at how peaceful they looked, despite the upheaval surrounding their young lives. "Do you think Eleanor will be all right?" "Your sister is stronger than she appears," Samuel said. "She'll handle whatever comes." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, they all knew the challenges Eleanor would face. Robert Whitmore's arrival, the questions from neighbors, the gossip and speculation that would follow their disappearance, it would all fall on her shoulders. The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they reached the outskirts of Macon. Samuel pulled the wagon into a grove of trees near the railroad station, and they prepared for the most dangerous part of their journey, the transition from the relative safety of the countryside to the public scrutiny of train travel. "Remember," Samuel said as he helped Margaret down from the wagon, "we're the Morrison family. I'm David Morrison, you're my wife Mary, and Catherine is my sister-in-law traveling with us to Philadelphia to visit relatives." They had rehearsed the story during the journey, creating a simple background that would explain their traveling together without raising suspicions. Dr. Morrison had provided Samuel with papers identifying him as a free man named David Morrison, a skilled carpenter seeking work in the north. Margaret nodded, though her heart was pounding. And if someone recognizes us? Then we improvise, Samuel said grimly. But the train will be full of travelers, and people tend to mind their own business on long journeys. Catherine gathered their bags while Samuel secured the wagon and horses. They had arranged for a local stable owner to collect the animals and return them to Whitmore Manor, another small detail designed to cover their tracks. As they walked toward the station, Margaret couldn't help but notice the stares they attracted. A well-dressed white woman traveling with a black man and carrying mixed-race babies was unusual enough to draw attention, even in the more progressive atmosphere of a railroad town. "Steady," Samuel murmured, sensing her nervousness. "We belong here just as much as anyone else." The station was bustling with early morning travelers, businessmen heading to Atlanta, families relocating to new opportunities, and the usual collection of drifters and adventurers that populated the post-war South. Margaret kept her head down, focusing on the babies while Samuel purchased their tickets. "3 tickets to Philadelphia," he said to the clerk, his voice steady and confident. The clerk looked up at Samuel, then at Margaret and Catherine, his expression curious but not hostile. "That'll be $18. Samuel counted out the money, and Margaret held her breath as the clerk processed the transaction. After what felt like an eternity, he handed over the tickets. "Train boards in 20 minutes, platform 2. They found seats on a bench near the platform, and Margaret began to relax slightly. They had cleared the first hurdle, but as they waited, she noticed a commotion near the station entrance. A group of men on horseback had arrived, and they were talking animatedly with the station master. "Samuel," she whispered, nodding toward the disturbance. Samuel followed her gaze, and his face went pale. Leading the group was a man Margaret recognized immediately, Sheriff Williams from their county, along with several other men she didn't know. "They're looking for us," Catherine said quietly. Samuel stood casually, as if stretching his legs, and moved closer to where he could hear the conversation. 3 people traveling together, white woman with 2 babies, another white woman, and a black man, probably heading north. Margaret's blood turned to ice. They had been discovered faster than expected. Samuel returned to their bench, his expression grim. "We need to get on that train, now." "But it hasn't arrived yet," Catherine protested. "There's a freight train on the other platform. If we can get aboard—" Margaret looked at the babies in her arms, then at the approaching sheriff's party. "Let's go." They gathered their belongings and moved as casually as possible toward the freight platform. The train was indeed there, loading cargo for the northbound journey. Samuel approached one of the railroad workers. "Excuse me, sir, is this train heading to Atlanta?" The worker, a grizzled man in his 50s, looked at their small group with curiosity. "It is, but this is freight only, no passenger cars." Samuel pulled out a $20 bill. "We have an emergency, family illness. We need to get to Atlanta as quickly as possible." The worker looked at the money, then at Margaret holding the babies. "There's an empty boxcar near the back. I didn't see you get on, understand?" "Understood. Thank you." They hurried toward the back of the train, and Samuel helped Margaret and Catherine into an empty boxcar that smelled of hay and livestock. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden from view. Just as Samuel was climbing in behind them, they heard shouting from the passenger platform. The sheriff's party had spotted them. "There, the black man with the white women." The train whistle blew, and with a great hiss of steam, the freight train began to move. Samuel slammed the boxcar door shut just as the first of the pursuing men reached their car. "Stop that train!" Sheriff Williams shouted, but it was too late. The locomotive was picking up speed, carrying them away from immediate danger. Margaret sank onto a pile of hay, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the babies. "That was too close, Samuel agreed, moving to the small window to watch the station disappear behind them. "But we made it." Catherine was examining their surroundings with practical eyes. "How long to Atlanta?" 4 hours, maybe 5, Samuel said. "We'll need to be careful when we arrive. They'll telegraph ahead, warn the authorities to watch for us." Margaret looked down at Thomas and Sarah, who had slept through the entire ordeal. "What have we done to them?" she whispered. "What kind of life is this?" Samuel knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "We've given them a chance, Margaret, a chance to grow up free, to choose their own path, to love without shame. That's more than they would have had if we'd stayed." But they'll always be running, always hiding who they are. No, Samuel said firmly. They'll be living as themselves, openly and honestly. That's not hiding, that's freedom. The train swayed and rocked as it picked up speed, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine what Philadelphia would be like, what kind of life they could build there. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Catherine moved to sit beside her sister. Do you regret it, leaving everything behind? Margaret considered the question seriously. I regret the pain we've caused Eleanor. I regret that our children will grow up without knowing their heritage, their family history. But regret loving Samuel, regret fighting for our family. Never. The hours passed slowly in the swaying boxcar. They shared water and bread that Catherine had packed, and Margaret nursed the babies when they woke. Samuel kept watch at the window, alert for any signs of pursuit. As they approached Atlanta, Samuel became increasingly tense. This is where it gets dangerous again. Atlanta is a major hub. If they're going to catch us, it'll be here. What do we do? Catherine asked. We stay on this train as long as possible, then find another way north. Maybe a different railroad line, maybe a riverboat. We'll figure it out. But as the train began to slow for its approach to Atlanta, Samuel saw something that made his heart sink. The platform was crowded with uniformed men, local police, railroad security, and what looked like federal marshals. They're waiting for us, he said grimly. Margaret joined him at the window and saw the assembled force. So many of them. They're not taking any chances, Samuel said. The question is, do we try to slip past them, or do we find another way? Catherine was studying a map she had brought. Look, she said, pointing to a spot south of Atlanta. There's a junction here, about 10 miles back, if we could get off there. The train's not stopping, Samuel pointed out. Then we jump. Margaret stared at her sister. Jump? With 2 babies. It's slowing down for the approach to Atlanta. We might be able to do it safely. Samuel considered the option. It's risky, very risky. Riskier than facing that welcoming committee? Catherine asked, nodding toward the platform. Margaret looked at her children, then at the man she loved, then at the sister who had chosen to share their exile. We jump. Samuel moved to the door and carefully slid it open a few inches. The train was indeed slowing, but it was still moving faster than was safe for jumping with babies. I'll go first, he said. Then catch the children when you hand them down. Samuel, no, Margaret protested. If you're hurt. If I'm hurt, you keep going. Promise me. Margaret wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. I promise. Samuel positioned himself at the door, waiting for the right moment. The train was passing through a wooded area with soft-looking ground covered in fallen leaves. Now, he said, and leaped. Margaret watched in terror as he hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up limping but standing. He waved for them to follow. Catherine went next, landing more gracefully and immediately moving to help Samuel. Margaret looked down at her babies, took a deep breath, and carefully lowered Thomas toward Samuel's waiting arms. The handoff was successful, and then Sarah followed. Finally, Margaret herself jumped, landing hard but safely in Samuel's arms. They gathered their scattered belongings and moved quickly into the woods, putting distance between themselves and the railroad tracks. Behind them, they could hear the train continuing toward Atlanta and the trap that awaited. Now what? Margaret asked, cradling the babies who had begun to cry from the excitement. Samuel looked around, getting his bearings. There's a road about a mile east of here. We can follow it north, stay off the main routes. On foot? With babies? Catherine asked. Until we can find another way. A farmer with a wagon maybe, or a smaller railroad line. Margaret looked at the man she loved, dirty and limping from his jump from the train, and felt a surge of admiration for his determination. Lead the way. As they began walking through the Georgia woods, carrying everything they owned, and the 2 babies who represented both their greatest joy and their greatest challenge, Margaret realized that this was just the beginning. They had escaped immediate capture, but they were still hundreds of miles from safety, still fugitives in a world that would never accept their love. But they were together. They were free. And for the first time since the babies were born, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten: hope.